Spider-Woman by Simon J. The steady drip of rain through the trees was all that disturbed the drone of the parson's prayers as they laid Maud Roxby to rest in the sodden little churchyard on the edge of the Yorkshire moors. It was just as well the sky was weeping, for it would have been difficult to find another moist eye among the handful of mourners huddled beneath their umbrellas around the grave. If Maud Roxby had a friend in the world, it wasn't in this part of Yorkshire. As if her viper's tongue had not been enough to alienate the villagers, over the years her behaviour had grown progressively more strange, and since being invalided in a fall, she had developed into a total recluse, with only her long-suffering husband Tom for company. To all the villagers, Tom was little short of a saint, quiet, selfless, uncomplaining. For more than a year he had struggled manfully to keep the farm going on his own, the last labourer having left in protest at Maud's outbursts, swearing she was a witch in disguise. If so, it had never brought her or Tom much luck. In old Dan Roxby's time, the farm where they lived had been one of the best in the district, but over the years a strange blight had killed the crops and destroyed the cow herd, so that it was all poor Tom could do to raise a few vegetables. Poor Tom. It was mostly for him that they had bothered to put their macs on at all that day. Rose Hardcastle looked out smugly from beneath the brim of her brolly, and secretly congratulated herself on seeing that a respectable number were present at the funeral. Rose and Tom had courted in years gone by, but eventually he had married the boss's daughter and she had wed the local smithy. Since the untimely death of her husband, Rose had gone as cook to Colonel Fortescue. Well, that wouldn't last much longer if she had anything to do with it. Although past her prime, Rose was still an impressive woman with a large, generous figure and thick, sensual mouth, a vivid contrast to the thin lips and bony chassis of the late lamented Maud. She also rather fancied herself as a farmer's wife. So far, everything had gone to plan. After years of never a word and barely a glance, she had plucked up courage to visit the farm and offer her assistance during his wife's illness. Tom had received her with his customary coolness, but later the way he had flushed on seeing her bent buxomly over the sink made her think that her presence did not exactly leave him cold. It came as something of a shock, therefore, when Tom gasped and visibly staggered as the coffin was lowered from view, and a faint doubt crossed her mind that perhaps there had been more between Tom and Maud than she realized. But Rose was a determined woman, and quickly tossed the idea aside, so that by the time the cortege reached the farm, she was her usual ebullient self, dispensing sherry and snacks, while Tom stared moodily out of the window. Every so often, his glance would shift uneasily to a glass case lying on the sideboard. Frank, a cousin of Tom's, sidled over curiously. "What's this, then, Tom?" he began, but the words stuck in his throat as he gazed through the glass lid at a monstrous spider the size of a saucer, with 8 long, spindly legs covered in fine black hair. "By gum, that's a big un. Where did you find it?" Frank inquired. The fat, round body rested on a piece of heavily embroidered silk, covered with strange signs and hieroglyphics. Tom, who was daydreaming, jerked back to consciousness. What did you say? Oh, that. It belonged to Maud. Here, why don't you take it? So saying, he picked up the case and with some force tried to pass it into his cousin's arms. Frank stepped back a pace and threw up his hands in horror. Not me, thanks. Why, I'd never sleep at nights with a thing like that in the house. No offence, of course. And he nervously shook off all of Tom's entreaties to take it. One by one, the guests drifted away, until only Rose and Tom were left in the little whitewashed parlour. The widow woman was wearing a black fitted skirt and broderie and glaze blouse that flattered her ample figure. She smoothed her skirt, fluffed her hair, and taking Tom by the arm, led him to the armchair. I'm going to make you a nice cup of hot tea, she announced. No. The sharpness in Tom's voice caught her by surprise. He immediately softened his tone, but there was still an unexpectedly firm edge to his voice. Thank you, Rose, you've been very kind, but, well, right now, I'd like to be alone if you don't mind. Rose flushed, then relaxed. Very well, she said with artificial calm. I'll drop back tomorrow then and give you a hand with the clearing up. For a long time after she'd gone, Tom stood staring at the monster insect, seated like an Eastern potentate on an elaborate cushion. Then he bent down and drew from the farthest corner of the sideboard a nearly full bottle of scotch. He poured himself a stiff measure and sipped it meditatively. His eye traced every detail of the intricate needlework on which Maud had laboured so frantically during her illness. What did it mean? Where had the spider come from in the first place? Whenever he had asked Maud these questions, she had smiled strangely to herself and carried on stitching. The mystery didn't end there, though. He hoped the others hadn't spotted his shock at the graveside, but those coffin handles had given him quite a turn. Instead of being plain brass, they were made of wrought iron, roughly resembling the creature in the glass case. He shivered and poured himself another scotch. Next morning, when the undertaker arrived to open the funeral parlour, Tom Broxby was waiting for him. Dixon, I want a word with you. Seeing the anger in his face, the undertaker quickly ushered him inside. Not until they were safely seated in his office did he allow Tom the opportunity to speak. Now, Mr. Roxby, he crooned soothingly, what seems to be the trouble? Tom told him. Ernest Dixon's black eyebrows rose in amazement. But you sent a note the day after your wife died, specifically ordering them. Did I, hell? Without another word, the undertaker took a letter from a sheaf of papers on his desk and handed it to the other man. Tom read it and blanched. He recognized the blue notepaper and the writing. On a separate sheet was a neatly drawn sketch of the spider's crest handles. The notepaper was his late wife's, and so was the writing. Tom didn't tell Dixon that. He realized that the man would have thought him demented. He simply insisted that the letter was a forgery and left. When Tom got back from the village, Rose had already arrived and was preparing a stew. He started to protest, but this time she was ready for him and would have none of it. "Yesterday I listened to you. Now I'm going to have my say," she told him. Tom was staggering slightly from the effects of the whisky drunk at the Barley Moor following the revelation at the undertaker's. "In that case," he said slyly, "you'd better get used to some of my baser habits." So saying, he grabbed her to him, pinning her arms to her sides, and pulled her dress above her waist. Then he rubbed himself against her corseted tummy. Rose squealed like a schoolgirl, but quickly relaxed and whispered something into his ear. He grinned and followed her upstairs into the bedroom. That night, after Rose had gone, Tom's sleep was punctuated by the most frightful nightmare, all the more terrifying for its realism. He dreamed that the big black spider in the case downstairs stirred, arched its back, and forced open the glass lid of its prison. From there it crawled leg by leg down the side of the furniture, dropping with a fat plop on the stone floor. The ghastly insect, which seemed twice as large in the open, made strange hissing sounds, and from every corner of the farmhouse, ants, slugs, spiders, and beetles scurried, squirmed, slithered, and crawled to the parlour till the floor was seething with them. Then, horror of horrors, they formed a repulsive, creeping column and followed their new-found leader up the stairs and through the open door of Tom's bedroom, where they danced a devil's tango round his twisting, tormented form. When Tom awoke, bleary-eyed, his pyjamas were soaked in sweat, and he was shivering uncontrollably. The dream was still vivid in his mind, but of the legion of insects there was no sign. The dawn was just breaking, and he had decided to go downstairs and make himself some tea. Half suspecting what he might find, Tom entered the parlour and saw instantly that the glass case was empty. He substituted Scotch for tea, uncertain whether to be glad or afraid that the fearful thing had gone. All morning, wherever he went in the house or yard, he kept searching the ground, walking with trepidation in case the hairy beast might suddenly appear under his foot. Once, when his boots squelched in some mud, his stomach reached into his mouth and he was sick on the spot. His relief when Rose arrived was unconcealed. He never left her side all day and insisted on making love several times, agreeing frantically to her every demand, including a promise to marry her as soon as was decent. Only by losing himself in her arms was he able to escape the steadily worsening vision that had confronted him. Long after nightfall, he still begged her to stay, but Rose refused point blank, dressing for the last time and putting on her hat and coat with the cold composure of a daily whose work was done. Tom resolved to stay awake as long as he could, but no sooner had Rose left than he fell into a sort of trance. Slowly, out of his subconscious, the spider grew to giant size. It was sitting on an unmarked grave, which he recognized as his wife's. Between the two foremost legs, the spider held something which looked unpleasantly like a mouse or rabbit. Every so often, the head portion of the great bloated shape would bend and chew ferociously. The clouds scudded across the moonlit sky, leaving strange patterns on the silent tombs. Suddenly, the gross black object stopped feeding and seemed to strain to catch the sound of approaching footsteps. The enormous insect moved like lightning, running through the tall grass until it melted into the shadow of the cemetery wall. The footsteps continued firmly along the path that ran alongside the cemetery down to the village. As the moon broke from behind some clouds, its pale light illuminated the advancing figure of Rose Hardcastle. She was humming contentedly to herself, totally unaware of the terrible creature just a few feet away. As her footsteps receded, one hideous hairy leg inched into view, followed by another and another and another, until the dreadful mutation was astride the wall. It poised there for a second, tracking the footfalls, then stealthily creeping down the wall, it followed the helpless woman into the darkness. Tom woke up, screaming his mistress's name. He was still fully clothed and sitting in the armchair where he'd fallen asleep. He stalked around in an agony of indecision. He wanted to rush out and warn her, but every time he tried to take a step toward the door, his legs refused to move. Finally, helped by some more whiskey, he quietened down. Perhaps after all it had just been an awful dream. He would know soon enough. Meantime, he made up his mind not to sleep again, despite the tiredness weighing him down. He stripped to his underclothes, put his feet in a bath of cold water, and awaited the daylight. As soon as the sun was up, he was dressed. He armed himself with a shotgun and set out along the path to the village. As he neared the place in his dream, his step grew shorter, and it was only with a supreme effort of will that he forced himself to peer over the cemetery wall, shotgun raised. There was nothing but the tall grass, the tombs, and, in the distance, his wife's grave. He moved on down the path, glad that his knees had stopped shaking. The path passed through a copse, and at the foot of a tree he found Rose. At least he assumed it was Rose, from one shoeless foot sticking out of the end of a grey, tightly wound cocoon that otherwise totally enveloped the body. There was no movement now from the sticky mass, but she'd obviously put up a grim fight for life before succumbing. Her shoes and handbag were strewn around the ground, and the bark at the base of the tree was furrowed and blood-stained where the woman had struggled to drag herself free of the suffocating mass by her fingernails. Tom tremblingly took in the terrible scene, too frightened to move. Then his nerve cells responded, and he ran hell for leather for the farm. He didn't stop till he reached the house and lay panting on the floor for half an hour until he'd recovered his breath. Then, shouting wildly to himself, he went all around the windows, boarding them up with planks bodily torn from the old cowshed. Finally, he locked and barred all the doors. Soon they would find Rose's body and come investigating. Perhaps they wouldn't. It didn't really matter. Instinctively, Tom knew there was no point in running or asking for protection. There was no escape, unless he could somehow face the horror and overcome it. Totally exhausted, he took himself and the remains of the whiskey to bed. When he awoke, he realized with immense relief that for the first time in 2 days he had slept without the terrible nightmare attacking him. He went into the bathroom and slooshed his face. This morning he was more rational. He would leave the farm, leave the country if necessary, He would never return. He turned off the tap, and as he did so, he caught a sound from somewhere below. His heart missed a beat, and his stomach turned over as he stood stock still, listening for confirmation that his ears had not deceived him. They had not. It was there again. Only one door in the house squeaked like that. The cellar. The one place he'd forgotten to check. He rushed for the stairs. Perhaps there was still time. Holy Mother of God, there wasn't. As he reached the stair, he could already see the monstrous shape moving along the hallway. He retreated, gibbering into the hallway, and looked wildly around for protection. The candlestick. He grabbed it and threw it down again in disgust. The shotgun. He left it by his bed. In heaven's name, where was it? He whirled around in puzzlement and dismay. Of course, he'd taken it to the bathroom. He must get there first. He threw open the door and slammed it again, his scream vibrating through the rafters. There it was, at the head of the stairs, barring his retreat. The great thick body perched on legs like stilts, the whole covered by a mass of black hair, and that head, that terrible, brooding head, staring straight at him. He scrambled across to the old oak chest standing in the corner and strained to heave it across to the door. Even as the chest began to move, his strength dissolved with the gradual lifting of the latch. He could imagine the furry, stick-like legs grappling with the strange human contraption and slowly winning. Shrieking hysterically, he rushed for the window, preferring to die on the cobbles below rather than be the victim of such an abomination. The pain smashed beneath his fists, and his hands grew bloodier and bloodier as he beat pathetically on the boards with which he had secured and barred his own exit. He couldn't bear to look round. Even so, he sensed that the door was opening under the weight of the thing gathered on the other side, and a foul, indescribable smell filled the room and choked his nostrils. His hands were in ribbons, but he felt no pain, only an unbearable revulsion for the thing crawling stiff-legged towards him. His loathing knew no bounds, and his screams reached a crescendo as the voice of his wife, seeming to come from a great distance, spoke to him. "You should have known better than try to get rid of me, Tom Roxby," the voice hissed. "You thought you were clever, lacing my food with just enough arsenic to make my death seem natural. I could have had you arrested any time I liked, but I wanted to die, so I let you do the job for me. You see, I belong with the powers of darkness, and so very soon will you, my poor unfortunate husband." Tom Roxby's cries died beneath the great, hairy embrace, and when the spider's work was done, he was completely clothed in a thick, grey shroud of death.